Hey, Mr. Marshall. We are recording. Amherst Media is with us, and they gave us the good to go thumbs up sign. You have a quorum of the board at 6:32. I don't believe we have any attendees at the moment, but I'll just keep watching. Oh, one has arrived. So yes, the attendees are coming on in. I think we're good to go.
All right. Thank you, Pam.
Welcome.
Welcome to the Amherst Planning Board meeting of February 5th, 2025. My name is Doug Marshall, and as chair of the Amherst Planning Board, I am calling this meeting to order at 6:31 p.m. This meeting is being recorded and is available live stream via Amherst Media. Minutes are being taken. Pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021 and extended by Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2023, this planning board meeting, including public hearings, will be conducted via remote means using the Zoom platform. The Zoom meeting link is accessible on the meeting agenda, posted on the town website's calendar listing for this meeting, or go to the planning board webpage and click on the most recent agenda where the Zoom link is listed at the top of the page. No in-person attendance of the public is permitted. However, every effort will be made to ensure the public can adequately access the meeting in real time via technological means. In the event we are unable to do so, for reasons of economic hardship or despite best efforts, we will post an audio, video, or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting on the town's website. Board members, I will take a roll call. When I call your name, unmute yourself, answer affirmatively, and return to mute. Bruce Colden.
I'm here.
Fred Hartwell.
I am here.
Lawrence Klutz.
I am here.
Jesse Major.
Present.
I, Doug Marshall, am present. Johanna Newman is going to be late, and we will try to announce her time of arrival. And finally, Karen Winter.
Present.
Thank you all. Board members, if technical issues arise, we may need to pause to fix the problem and then continue the meeting. If the discussion needs to pause, it will be noted in the minutes. Please use the raise hand function to ask a question or make a comment, and I will call on you to speak. After speaking, remember to remute yourself. To the general public, the general public comment item is reserved for public comment regarding items not on tonight's agenda. Please be aware the board will not respond to comments during general public comment period. Public comment may also be heard at other times during the meeting when deemed appropriate by the planning board chair. Please indicate you wish to make a comment by clicking the raise hand button when public comment is solicited. If you have joined the Zoom meeting using a telephone, please indicate you wish to make a comment by pressing *9 on your phone. When called on, please identify yourself by stating your full name and address and put yourself back into mute when finished speaking. Residents can typically express their views for up to 3 minutes or at the discretion of the planning board chair. If a speaker does not comply with these guidelines or exceeds their allotted time, their participation may be disconnected from the meeting. All right, that's the preamble. We can move on to item 1 of our agenda, minutes. We have the December 4th minutes in our packet. Board members, any comments on these minutes? Bruce.
I'm good with the minutes, with the singular exception, which probably ought to change. I'm listed on page 2 as making the motion, but I'm listed as Oldham and not Coldham. So so far as the possibility that people might think that Jim Oldham has replaced me on this board, we might want to put a C in front of it. Otherwise, I'm prepared to move to accept.
All right.
Bruce, can you just tell me what topic what topic?
Oh, it's the motion, and just a minute, I made a note here. I said it's on.
Oh, I see it. Item number 3. Got it.
Yeah, page 2, motion.
My apologies.
That's all right. I mean, we do that all the time.
Well, at least we know somebody looked them over before the meeting. Okay, let's see. Bruce, you want to go ahead? Well, let's see. Jesse,
I
you had
did,
your hand
yes.
up for a while. Do you want to make the next comment, whatever it is?
Yes, I actually had one minor suggestion of a change. I was just trying to find it. It was in the subcommittee report. I was listed as saying, I could tell you now, or you would hear about the consequences of the report later. I wasn't a fan of that term consequences, but sorry, let me try and find the exact wording because it was just a little negative sounding and I don't think it meant to be.
Outwash.
Oh, there it is, the bottom of page 1. Sorry, top of page 2. Mr. Major noted that the housing subcommittee met last week. He said he could provide a report now, or the board could hear the consequences of that meeting later. Maybe we could just change that word to be summary or something, so it doesn't have a negative connotation.
Or hear a report of that meeting.
Yeah, report would be fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
And with those 2 changes, I'd move to accept the minutes.
All right. Anybody want to second the motion to
I'll
Uh,
second.
Bruce, you beat Karen.
I second.
Oh, I'll defer to Karen.
I
Well,
second.
okay. Pam, you can
Okay.
decide who to record as having seconded that.
I have a lot of scribbles. That's why I make errors when I write the minutes.
All right. We know Jesse made the motion and
I put down Karen.
somebody seconded it. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Bruce said he deferred to Karen, so I put Karen.
All right. So are there any additional comments before we proceed with the vote? All right. I guess I'll just go straight through the roll. Bruce,
Aye.
Fred,
Aye.
Lawrence.
Muted aye.
Aye, okay. Jesse,
Aye.
no Johanna yet. Karen,
I
I'm an aye as well. 6 in favor, 1 absence. Motion carries. So we have those motions approved, or those minutes approved. All right, time is 6:38. Next item is public comment period. So members of the public, now is the time to raise your hand if you want to make a comment at this time regarding a topic that does not appear later on our agenda. I usually read the names of the people I can see as attendees, so I will do that now. We have 3 attendees. One is a person named Christine Brestrup, Elizabeth Vierling, and Janet Keller. So that is the sum total of our attendees. Excuse me, at this time. Despite my lengthy introduction for that, I still don't see any hands raised for public comment. So I guess I will assume none of the 3 folks listed or that I named want to make a public comment at this point. So time now is 6:39. We'll go to the 3rd item on the agenda, which is the Open Space and Recreation Plan. Discussion regarding the process and updates of the updated 2024 Open Space and Recreation Plan. Nate, may I assume you would like to introduce that?
Sure. Yeah. I don't have anything to share. I was hoping to have updated goals, objectives, and strategies that might come at, in the next meeting or 2. I just want to let you know that staff's been working on the plan. And so we had, outreach efforts done last year into the fall. It's a state prescribed plan with 11 chapters and really section, the latter sections 6 through 9 are the, section 6 is about the goals, and 7 and 8 and 9 really lead you into the action steps and an action plan map. And so we've been working on that. And so, the planning board has to review it and approve it and send a letter to the state when we want to have it submitted. And so we're hoping to do that probably by June 30th of this year. We thought we might need it earlier for some grant applications. We still might, but we're working with the assumption that we have a few more months. And so we've just been really working through it. It is a long plan right now. We're trying to consolidate it. I think it's over 200 pages. It seems like a lot of them are getting that big. And it, we're considering it a new plan. So we had a plan in 2009, a plan in 2017, and now this plan, our current open space and rec plan expired last year in 2024. I think we're going to just call this a 2025 plan and submit it to the state and try to recommend that it be in place for 10 years. The state has the discretion. They used to be for 3 to 5 years, and it seems like for the effort to update it, it could be longer. So I had presented it a few months ago, and I just wanted to bring it back to let the planning board know where it is and what's happening.
All right. Do you plan to bring it to us at some point soon, or are you going to wait several months?
I'll probably bring it back in March. At that point, we'd have hopefully the goals and everything ready, and we probably have a draft plan that could be shared, in advance of a meeting, and board members could read it, and then we could talk about, different parts of the plan.
Okay. Board members, any questions or comments about that document and the process? Okay. Members of the public, any comments about the open space and recreation plan? Okay, not seeing any hands from either set of people. All right, time is 6:42. We'll go on to the fourth item on the agenda, accessory dwelling units.
Sure.
Nate.
Thanks. Yeah, I could speak to that. The inspection services department has been working to, set up an online application form, which they've done. I think it went live today. So, the state enacted the new protected ADU legislation, and now it's effective. And so anyone can apply for, this new definition, this new accessory dwelling unit. We also have our existing bylaw, which is in place. And so really someone could apply for the local, we'll call it a local ADU through our bylaw, which allows, 1,000 square feet, but comes with the provision of owner occupancy and some other conditions and some possibly some land use permitting. And then there's this protected ADU that, now is allowed by the state. And so, until the planning board or others make a decision, that's kind of this parallel, ADU we'll have. The state updated the regulations, they've been finalized. And so what was sent in the packet was a marked up version. They were just finalized this week, and you can download them online. I did, and I hadn't verified to see. Someone from the state said there weren't any changes, but I haven't confirmed that. And so really now there's a set of regulations. The state said by the end of January, but now here we are February, that they would also have a model bylaw, and that hasn't come out yet. So, staff's been waiting to see how the state would interpret parts of the rules and regulations as well, just because we have some questions. We met earlier this week, and, it doesn't, although the rules and regulations clarify the legislation in terms of some things, it doesn't for everything. And I know some other communities have been posting questions online, and, building commissioners or staff have been talking. So I think, I can share the screen, we can go over them. We were working on a draft bylaw, and, right now I feel like the rules and regulations are, cover a lot of the questions we had. And I think probably half the bylaw we had is now inconsistent with the state regulations. So, my question for the board would be, do we need a second ADU bylaw? We could just even include just a definition of protected use ADU in our zoning. And then we could just keep the bylaw we have and just say it's a local ADU that, is, so then we always allow two options. Or we could try to come up with a bylaw that can follow the state regulations and legislation. I feel like there'd be very few requirements or conditions we could have, that would be reasonable or could fit the regulations. And so that's kind of why, staff decided to wait for the state just to see what they say are, example of reasonable regulations. So, they say you can't regulate the design any more than a single family home. You can't regulate dimensional standards really any more than a single family home. You can't have occupancy requirements for, the ADU or principal dwelling. Some of the things we had in our other bylaw, we talked about some kind of design standards. There are 3 or 4, which probably are considered unreasonable. We had some dimensional standards, which are probably unreasonable. We had some things about, kind of minimizing a lot, which hasn't been determined, but people are asking. And so there's a few things like that. We had the submittal of a parking management plan, which is in our current bylaw, which is not inconsistent with the state. So in our current bylaw, we have, like 20 general requirements, and 3 or 4, maybe 5 of those are in compliance with the new state legislation, and the building commissioner and staff can ask someone who's applying for a protected ADU. So we say it needs to have a parking management plan, a property management plan, comply with the rental registration bylaw, and all those can still be enforced and applied to the protected ADU. But a lot of the other standards we have, about where parking can or can't happen, or the entrance has to be on the side of a building, all those things would probably be considered unreasonable. And so, I guess right now it's kind of a question and discussion with the board. Do we want to investigate a few parts of what we were proposing as a bylaw and have, staff and possibly KP Law, the town attorneys, look into it a little bit and come with something in the next month or 2? I think some communities are doing that. I know we've, Rob Moore, the building commissioner, has talked to a few communities, and they said they're just holding tight until the state, their template bylaw comes out, because, that'll ostensibly have some clear, conditions and standards that other towns can apply. There is the state offered, which is unusual for cities or towns. I mean, for cities, especially to send draft bylaws to them for their review. And so they don't typically do that. And so, if we have some questions, we could do that.
All right. I'll state for the record, I think Johanna just arrived at 6:48 p.m. Nate, was there anything else you wanted to say, or are you finished?
I'm finished for now.
Okay. So I see 3 hands up. We'll start with Bruce.
Nate, you said that the state hadn't produced the model bylaw yet, but the attachment that you gave us, which had a lot of strikeouts and additional red and all this sort of stuff, is headed state ADU regulation, revised state ADU regulation. So I understood that the state, that was a state document, and I was going to ask you whether the strikeouts and so forth in that, the red, is that done by the state, or is that done by you taking the state model and adjusting it?
No, that was a state document. So that was their edits after the public hearing in January.
Okay.
That was a state group that did that. When I meant a state bylaw, they were actually going to provide like a template zoning bylaw for communities to use. So different from their regulations, possibly a template zoning bylaw or general regulation or something. Could be a general bylaw on how to regulate ADUs.
I thought that's what that would be, because I noticed there's a very large number of definitions, and some of those definitions will be relevant to cities and towns like Cambridge, for example, or inner city areas with definitions of transit stations and so forth, and others, but that won't probably be so relevant. So I thought the plan was you take this, and towns take it, and then they adjust it. And then, because there's no model bylaw that's going to work for all towns, and so it'll have to be adjusted by one town after another, and then presumably go back to the state bureaucracy for a review, just like all bylaws do. Is that?
Yeah, my thought is the state wants ADUs to happen, and so. I think in the revised regulations, they clarified a lot that had been asked, and there's still some pieces that need to be interpreted. But to me, it's basically they're saying, just give the ADU a building permit. right? Don't waste your time trying to regulate it with all these other standards or limit occupancy or only have 2 bedrooms in the ADU or all these other things. They basically say, to me, it's like they're saying, we put a lot of detail and description in the rules and regs, just follow it. You know, there were, for instance, model or bylaws from towns with fall town meeting that they were passed, you know, in the fall, October, November, that said, you know, limit ADUs to 3 occupants, limit ADUs to 1.5 stories, and they had different dimensional setbacks than they did in their zoning. And so my guess is the AG's office at some point is going to have to review those and deny those parts of the bylaw because it's really inconsistent with the regulation. So these communities, you know, were proactive, try to get something on the books ahead of February 2nd, but before any state guidance came out. And so, you know, I think some of those conditions they have are, you know, really can't be allowed.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm comfortable with the idea that we have our current bylaw, which has got the provision for 1,000 units, which we keep that so that we don't have basically create a whole class of non-conforming ADUs. And it's an ADU which is bigger and you apply by special permit, but alongside that is the by right. And I imagine that it would be appropriate to have some preamble or statement in at the beginning of that section of our bylaw that says this bylaw is supplementary, is additional to the by right state law. So people who are out of town picking up our bylaw don't get confused about whether they think somehow Amherst has got a special condition, that this is an extra condition, and we should make that clear. But otherwise, I agree with you. It doesn't seem as though it's worth our effort to create, because we know creating new bylaws is quite a lengthy process with the public hearings we have and all that. And I'm kind of with you, Nate. It doesn't seem to me as though we need to do that, or certainly not yet. We could probably delay a year or two before we find out whether we really need to or not.
All right. Jesse.
Thanks. Couple of questions. I'm a little confused about this idea of having the 2 remain. And I guess my confusion is it's not like someone can want to build an ADU and then choose which set of bylaws they want to use, right? Are you saying we only leave the old one for the existing ones so they wouldn't be still in compliance? Like what? And is it only if someone wants a 950 or 1,000 square foot that then they would go to our other bylaw? But if somebody, what if I wanted to build a 900 square foot one, but follow our standards for some reason? Would that be okay? Or that's automatically the protected one? And like, I'm just thinking of what possible differences and problems we could have with that situation.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's a good question. No, we'd allow the 2 and it'd be an optional choice. It's kind of like right now, if someone wanted to have 2 units on their property and they have a big house, they could do it as a duplex, an ADU, a converted dwelling, or a subdividable dwelling, or maybe even a townhouse, right? So there's many routes to get to that kind of n number of units. And so, you know, we had always thought maybe we'd keep the existing bylaw. When I asked an attorney at KP Law with the previous rules and regulations, you know, she said you could keep it both to not have the nonconformities, but also a lot of communities are doing that just to allow, you know, something different. So, you know, we don't need to, right? We could change our existing one. It's just that it works and it had been working. And so if someone really wants to have that big, it's really if they just want a bigger ADU, that they would go that route, but they would be subject to that bylaw. You know, if someone's like, if someone qualifies as a protected ADU, my guess is they're a protected ADU, unless they voluntarily say, I want to be, you know, they'd have to let the town know I'm applying under, you know, the whatever, you know, section of the bylaw. And then, you know, with that would come an owner occupancy requirement and whatever else is in there. So an owner could do that voluntarily.
Okay.
Well, Nate, I mean, if a proposal shows up with the building commissioner and it's bigger than 900 square feet, Rob's going to say, well, you've got to do it under the other,
Right.
Even if they're not aware of it.
Right.
And if it's below 900, he'll probably just approve it because it's by right.
Well, we have 2 separate applications on our website now that there's a few, I haven't looked at it, but there were questions to that effect saying, you know, there's the state, we have our local bylaw, and just a few questions that you would answer that would help guide you to what application you'd submit. So the idea would be that by the time someone is actually getting into the application, they're aware that they're, applying under the new protected ADU or our existing bylaw.
Okay, thanks. Can I ask my other question?
Yep.
I guess the question is, do we want to dive into our proposal for the change now, or do we want to wait and bring that back about our proposal for the student home definition relating to the ADU bylaw?
Yeah, so Jesse and I have been emailing, and he was asking if the student home definition could, still could be applied to ADUs. And in some instances, the building commissioner, I think it would be deemed unreasonable, maybe not. And so, I told Jesse we could talk about it tonight, because if the board thinks it's something we would want to investigate, staff could look into it, and we could ask our attorneys to look into it. And so, what's always been in the rules and regs are these prohibited regulations, like you can't require owner occupancy. And then there's these unreasonable regulations, and it says that, if it has to not do these things. It can't like make it, essentially nullify the act by making it impossible to create an ADU, or, there's a few other standards. And so, essentially if if the planning board thinks our student home definition can withstand those conditions, then it could, be in our bylaw and apply to accessory dwelling units. And, my thought is there's probably a number of communities that have some standards and conditions they'd like to apply, and they're gonna be kind of doing the same thing, going through those conditions and the regulations, and they're going to say, well, I think it works, and that's kind of their argument. And then it becomes, it'll become a legal discussion if at some point someone disagrees. But so I think there's definitely some standards and conditions that we could say we think are reasonable that others might not, and we could have it in a bylaw.
Yeah, there's a couple of other additional points I'd like to add, and I would make the argument that I think it would still be okay if we're ready for that discussion. If we're not, I'll hold off.
Well, why don't we let Fred make his comment? We'll come right back to it. Fred? Fred, you are still muted.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
just cleared it. Yeah, I agree with Jesse, and I'm very interested in this process, Nate, about you can submit bylaws to the state for review. I would love to see this particular point reviewed. Let's get an answer to it, because it's it's not really restricting anything. It just says, okay, this is the definition of student home. No, you can't have both occupancies of student home. There's no owner occupancy requirement there. It doesn't. I think it's got a reasonable shot, especially, I think the state will, when they look at it, they are, have to be aware that it's coming from Amherst, Massachusetts, and I think pretty much everyone in the state understands that just maybe Amherst has a serious issue here, and this is not really obstructing the movement toward accessory dwelling units that the state has in mind, in terms of the occupancies that I think the state wants to create. And this idea of no more than one of the two can be a student home, that I think can be argued. I would certainly argue that supports the public policy objectives that the legislature had in terms of trying to create housing. And I don't think the legislature was trying to create dormitories. They were trying to create family housing. And this is in the town of Amherst, this is a very effective way to approach it. So yeah, I would support this.
All right. I guess I'll make one comment since everybody's had a chance to comment so far. And Jesse, I'll go right to you. I think this does create a disincentive for people to build an ADU because the chances of them renting one or the other units is diminished just because most of our renters are students. And are there enough, non-student people out there to occupy the second dwelling on that property? I don't know, but I can imagine if I were thinking about an ADU that would give me pause. Jesse, go ahead.
Thanks. So I guess we're diving in. So Fred brought up several of the points I was going to make, but I would start with saying I would not assume everybody knows this is coming from Amherst and we have an issue. So we really, whatever, I totally agree. We should send the bylaw and get their response. And I think we need to frame it in the way of the problem that we are experiencing very clearly. I would also point out, maybe some of you saw the Hampshire Gazette article today, that Provincetown, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket all got exemptions from this because of a short-term rental problem. Airbnbs driving out long-term residents. That is exactly the argument we need to make, that our student housing problem is driving out long-term stable residents. I 1000% believe that. I know many of you do. I do think that's a problem we have. I also fully believe this change is trying to make more housing for that population of permanent residents. So we can very effectively make that argument. I looked at the specific language, Nate, unless something's changed between what the sections you sent me. I don't think the way we proposed it is contrary to the language that's actually in the bylaw. And we can go through the specifics if the committee wants to look at it. But there were two sections specifically. And again, the way we worded it was very intentional, that we're not requiring owner occupancy, which is clearly we can't do. And we're not restricting use of the ADU in any way. There are two units. We're saying both cannot be a student rental or student home as we've defined it. So I really don't think it goes against the way it's crafted. I would also point out it's clearly not quite done because, and I'm no lawyer, but that one section says that basically there can be no requirement that a protected ADU be subject to a use and occupancy restriction. Does that mean I can build an ADU and open a petting zoo? Can I open a concert hall in my ADU? Like, obviously there's going to be restrictions, right? So clearly it's in process. And really my point is there's room, I think, to accomplish, if the majority of the board agrees, that we should move in this direction. Doug, to your point, disincentive because there might not be long-term residents who want to rent the other unit. Isn't that what the town wants? I certainly believe that's what the town wants. I don't know. And I would try and reframe this for staff and for our KP law, if we go that way, to help us figure out how to regulate this in that way to encourage long-term stable residents.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think, sometimes we think of ADUs as being, the owner of a property would not live in it. But, to me, it's also a way to age in place and downsize. And then actually the current homeowner or resident or tenant would live in the ADU, and they might then rent
Sure.
the existing, principal dwelling. And so there's probably some, ideas that we might have one path and what we think is going to happen, but there's different ways it gets used and applied. I will say the way the regulations are written, accessory dwelling units can be permitted and they're allowed on any property in a residentially zoned district that has just a dwelling. So it's not limited to a single family home or a duplex. A townhouse property has, could have an ADU. An apartment building can have an ADU now. And so, they clarified that in the updated rules and regulations, and it was asked at the public hearing. And I think the state, they don't, they define a principal dwelling. They don't call it a single family home. And then, so the way it's written is that, essentially any zoning district that allows a single family home and allows residential units can have an ADU. So a lot of our zoning districts in town will have ADUs, and it could be on more than just a single family home or a duplex. It's somewhat strange to think that you could have, like an 8-unit townhouse building that now can put an ADU on the property. But that's the way it's written. And I think, Jesse, to your point about the short-term rentals, I think the state has always been aware of short-term rentals, and they always allowed the regulation of them, you could prohibit them with the ADU bylaw and legislation. So whoever proposed this and put it forward always had short-term rentals in mind. I don't think they had the same concern about student rentals or other
No.
rentals.
So, sorry to interrupt, but the language I read was that the concern was they're driving out permanent residents as the basis of allowing it. And we are facing the same problem. That's my point.
Right. I think, but it's couched under a short-term rental.
I understand. It wouldn't be the same language, but the rationale would be the same.
No, I agree. I agree. I think the impact and what happens is the same. I just think that, I know the Berkshires had concerns about short-term rentals, right? That they're, it's replacing what they thought was going to be other housing stock. So, I don't know if the board, we want to go through the regulations or look at the bylaw, if there's other, questions. And so,
Well, I guess I'd like to make one more comment, Jesse, and that is, from outside of Amherst and perhaps from Boston, it could look like Amherst has a problem with short-term rent or with people being driven out by students, and wonder why we didn't just build more housing. And if we refused to build more housing, that's our problem. So I'm not sure everybody's going to be as sympathetic as we hope.
Agreed. But A, we're not preventing ADUs from being built. And B, let them tell us that then. Why are we going to decide what they're going to say in response to something we're proposing?
No disagreement with that approach. So Nate, why don't we look at the regs? And I guess one question I had about the regs was, how widely disseminated are they and accessible are they? If I'm a new builder in town and I want to know what the rules are, wouldn't I just go to my zoning bylaw? And you talked about putting a sentence at the beginning of this section or whatever, that this is one avenue and there is this other avenue. Is there any advantage to us including the model bylaw for the state in our bylaw, incorporating it into our document so that you don't have to go somewhere else to find the other rules?
When it's available, maybe, yeah. Yeah, I mean, right now, the way this, it's a good question too. I don't know how builders find out if they subscribe to a certain, listserv or resource. And so, there could be someone who applies, contacts the town and applies for an ADU. Then it's really on staff to alert them that there is this new regulation. And so when we met this week, that's what we've decided, that, there's 1 or 2 staff persons who will, help anyone who applies and, and help them in terms of, educating them what's available for options. And so, we're kind of operating under that assumption that it's our responsibility. Other communities might not, right? So someone might not really even, yeah, I agree. Like a homeowner, I mean, most homeowners probably have, don't even know, right? So they might say, oh, I'd love to build this, a little, maybe a small unit on my property. They don't even know that it's called an accessory dwelling unit, right? And so hopefully someone's going to help them, whether that's their contractor or an official or something. The state has it on their website. I don't know, I get it through email, through different listservs or subscriptions. I don't know how others perceive it.
Yeah, I guess it seems to me we probably ought to have a sentence or two at the start of the bylaws of the ADU section that says there are 2 avenues. One is by right from the state. And, you know, here's where you can find it, or something, or here it is listed. And then there's a second one that's peculiar to Amherst, and, you know, here's the rules for that, or, you know, go to that section. So I just think something up front to set the context for anybody as they enter the process before they show up at the building office with a set of plans or whatever. You know, I just don't know how well people prepare.
Yeah, I mean, that still is a process. That's a zoning change. So I feel like if we're gonna do that, we might as well talk about what else we'd have.
Yeah,
Like I said, we've already put it on our inspection services website and on our building permit application, so
okay,
hopefully we capture it at least there.
all right. Well, I don't feel strongly about that because it's not going to be me that's confused, but you know, maybe see how it works and whether you need something else. Bruce.
Doug, I kind of shared your concern mildly. That became more mild still, I think, when I thought a bit about this. I think we can all imagine that every small builder in the state is going to know very well that this represents an opportunity for them to be able to build things where they don't have to go through the complicated regulatory process, special permit process that they typically hate to do. So something that happens that creates work opportunities that are simple and uncomplicated for small-time builders, I think the word is going to get out through that through that means as well. So I think that along with what Nate said about what's on the website and what the building inspectors are going to say when people come in the door and so forth, suggests to me that it's not going to be a big problem, that there's not going to be a lot of confusion, that the commercial opportunity associated with this for so many small town builders is going to essentially be the solution to this problem.
All right.
You know, I will say that, you know, other, you know, property owners, both for that would, you know, be owner occupied ADUs have called and asked about this, but then, you know, other investor owned properties have inquired about this. So I do think we are going to see, you know, properties that can take advantage of this and have it become a student rental. You know, I don't know if it's going to be an overwhelming change or not, but, you know, I think when we're talking about University Drive overlay, you know, I like the conversation, the context that it's really about providing housing. I think we need to then continue to look at other areas in town to allow dense multi-unit housing. We've talked about the apartment overlay. I feel like East Amherst, I'll say Gateway again, areas around University. I feel like you know, Amherst can't do it alone. So at some point, I think we probably have to talk regionally. UMass put out that RFP, Jesse, that you mentioned at the last meeting, seeking some ideas. That's going to be a long-term approach. But you know, in the short term, we could see a fair amount of applications. And, you know, I think it's worth working on changes to the bylaw, whether or not we come up with a whole new, you know, set of regulations. But even Doug, to your point, there could be just small changes we want to make to our ADU section now, like that intro or something, or, you know, if we put a student home definition in, and, you know, so I'd say we should work on something in the next month or two and then try to get it to council as soon as possible anyways, if we think we should.
Well, does it have to go through council before it can go to the attorney general or whoever?
No, if the planning board, if we work on something and we have a draft, you know, bylaw in, you know, 3 meetings, I would send it to the state, you know, because we'll get their guidance and input, right? They might come back and ask us to justify some of our conditions, and then we'd have to justify it in terms of the regulation. So, I mean, I'm hoping it becomes it's an iterative process with the state too, not just, no, this doesn't work, but there's a chance for a town or a municipality to explain why they're doing something.
So would we start by asking KP Law the question? Or is there any point it's too new, they don't know any more than we do?
Yeah, I think they would probably take a conservative approach, you know, with a safeguard of the town in mind. And so I think some of it's too new. You know, for instance, the rules and regulations say 900 square feet. They mentioned gross square feet. they reference the building code, and then they mention basements, but the building code doesn't factor in unfinished space as part of floor area calculations. It's habitable space. And so, you know, we Amherst, through the building commissioner and the inspectors, they're going to interpret it a certain way. And other communities might interpret it completely different. And so, you know, it's unfortunate because I guess that was asked a lot about how they're kind of calculating the denominator in terms of how much space do you have, and then how do you get up to what you're allowed for an ADU. And, but, you know, they use some language that isn't really, you know, it's kind of zoning language, it's a little building code language, but it's not really any in either place, right? And so I think communities are going to have different interpretations of what it means to calculate the 900 square feet. Half the dwelling unit or 900 square feet, whatever is smaller. Even on that, I feel like communities are going to have their own interpretation. And it's too early to tell which one is right or what, you know, and maybe they're all going to be right. And so in terms of the student home or other conditions, I think it's too early to say whether or not it's inconsistent, unless it's, you know, if the state asks, I think we go have a conversation about how we think it's justified.
Okay, Jesse?
Thanks, Doug. Nate, so you said some LLC owned properties did inquire already? Is that like 1, 5, 20? What are we talking about? Because this has come up a few times in conversations, like, is there going to be a flood? Is there going to be rush?
You know, I'd say there's, you know, I fielded a few and other staff have. It could be that, you know, a half dozen owners or, you know, managers have asked, you know, that it's more, they would represent more than, you know, half a dozen properties. You know, it could mean 10 properties or 20. I don't know. They don't, you know, no one said, you know, it's not like, oh, I'm looking to put ADUs on 30 properties. They just call and say, I'm interested in this new legislation. And that might mean on one property that they own or manage, or it could mean 20. You know.
So my logic tells me basically as soon as we can, we should send something to the state and say, tell us if this is okay, or tell us what other kind of justification you need, rather than spending a very long time in this committee with KP Law, with staff, to then maybe send it to the state. Because they're going to be the final arbiters anyway, right? So,
well, no, if you have town meeting, it gets reviewed by the AG's office, but because we have a council form of government, it's usually just our town attorneys that reviews it. The state doesn't, and then it really just
no, but if let's say that happened and it passed our council and then it got challenged, wouldn't that go to the state?
No,
It'd just be in a lawsuit.
It'd be a lawsuit.
It'd be a judge, not the attorney, not the AG.
Yeah, that's what I was getting to. That with our form of government, once we pass a zoning amendment, it doesn't get reviewed by the state. It becomes just a legal issue after that, in terms of, you know, an appeal to the building commissioner first, could be, and then Superior Court or Land Court or.
And then sorry, just to follow up with something else you said, you think that KP Law would be conservative, meaning they would tell us we couldn't do this.
Right, and because, you know, they're going to have the interest of the town, right? They're not going to say, well, let's, you know, put some regulations that are maybe questionable that could lead to a lawsuit, right? They're going to say, let's be safe on behalf of the communities they represent. And so unless there's other guidance from other, you know, and they're talking to other attorneys,
Right.
KP Law represents multiple communities across the state. But, you know, like I said, I mean, this just got finalized last week. And like I said, you know, there's this question about how you calculate square footage, right? I mean, so I feel like there's
I'll just reiterate the fact that other communities are being given exemptions for the same rationale, different situation, but same rationale, makes me think we have to push forward on this. If the majority of the board agrees with me. I mean, it's that simple.
All right, Karen.
So I just want to weigh in that I absolutely agree with Jesse that this is our chance, and that we, especially, I didn't read the paper today, but you know, it just makes sense that if certain communities, because of reasons that the state recognizes, are able to get a waiver, that we should certainly push for what we all realize is a really legitimate reason that our town has to be cautious in just creating a lot of housing that's going to be student dorms, because we do want to create housing for everybody. And if there are so many student dorms, we haven't got a chance. We're gonna lose the neighborhoods that we have.
All right. So one other thing that just occurred to me was that this could have the result of distributing students more broadly across town, rather than having them concentrated, say, right around the university, which could be seen as a good thing or could be seen as a negative thing. How do the supporters for this feel about that? For Jesse.
Yeah, I agree, and that could be great. Meaning, I assume you're thinking, okay, neighborhoods where there are not typically rentals might decide to build an ADU, right, and rent to students. So
Yeah,
let's.
I'm thinking more about areas that are already rental, and is it better to have students concentrated kind of in their own areas, so to
I
speak?
understood. Okay, I misunderstood what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yes, I mean, we are trying to decide where those areas should be, right? That's what the overlay is about. I agree with that. I also agree that the town neighborhoods should remain permanent resident neighborhoods. So the established neighborhoods, like the one I live in, like on the north side of campus, and granted, they're the ones around the university where you live, Doug. I think we need to fight hard to keep those as viable permanent resident locations. And I think that's what we're losing.
okay. Well, I think that's where I probably disagree with you.
Fair.
So, Bruce.
I think if you're right, Doug, and this does head in a kind of a distributive way as opposed to a consolidating way, although there's no reason why it couldn't be both. I wouldn't object, because I think the way in which we're trying to establish this would be that there is a mix, that half of the property that has this ADU on it would have a more permanent resident. It may be an owner, or it may be rented to somebody who's not a student home, which likely is a more permanent resident, which is part of what Jesse's talking about in terms of maintaining family-friendly neighborhoods with some kind of maintained vitality, and that's the stakes here. So I support the idea that we should get an answer to this. I also support the proposition that it be delivered in a way that it represents that we are interested to the greatest degree possible in getting a positive answer to this from our point of view. So I wouldn't want to, I would try and figure out a way of not having this particular message carried into battle by a lawyer with a chariot with square wheels on it. That we would want to instruct the lawyer that the essence of this is to get a positive answer, and is there a way this can be approached in a way that has that outcome. I definitely think that the way in which you approach something like this has got your attitude, or the attitude of the communicator, has got a lot to do with the way it turns out, or it's got something to do with the way it turns out. And so I wouldn't want to go through the venue that we knew was a more conservative outlook, because the lawyer might have the interests of the town. And of course, that's the interests of the town as viewed by the lawyer, which is, as you say, a more conservative thing, which is basically to prevent the town from having to deal with more lawyers and costs of lawsuits and this kind of thing. So I would like to think that we could get an answer from the draftees of this thing. Maybe that's just my design mind thinking, because I'm always trying to figure out how you get the data that you can rely upon to design something that's going to be durable and worthwhile. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get a situation that as Fred articulated quite well, and Jesse as well, I support the proposition that we should try our best to have this interpretation enshrined and accepted in this permitted use.
All right. Karen?
Maybe one of the reasons why Jesse and I are so adamant about perhaps distributing this in the town and not having it concentrated is that we live in an area where we see that there's a definite tipping point. There are people that have lived in the middle of town for years and years and love it. And they've suffered through the house next to them and the next to them. And pretty soon they're surrounded and they're going to sell their house and the whole thing, another section of town is no longer a place where there's somebody that cares about planting flowers or how many cars are parked in the front. And is that really to the town's advantage to have the middle of town, this GP resident close to the university, go that way? I don't think so. I think it's worth our effort to try to keep that balanced. And in order to keep it balanced, we really need a restriction like this because we are the source where the investor can make the most money the fastest by just buying an old Victorian house, filling it with students, putting in 80, count up the amount of rent you can get for students and you'll realize that there's no longer going to be a staff person, a faculty person, a family, even seniors that's going to be able to compete. And then we've lost the center of town pretty quickly and it's going to be very hard to get back. So distributing in town, even though, that doesn't sound good, it's a way of keeping balance.
All right. Well, I certainly can read the room. We've got 4 members in favor of this. At some point, we'll probably need to vote on something. I see Jesse and then Lawrence.
Thanks, Doug. Just to give a clear example of what Karen's talking about, I'm sure you're all familiar with McClellan Street. When I moved here 18 years ago, probably moving from North Pleasant Street, the first 5 or 6 houses, 4 houses on both sides were student rentals. As of now, 18 years later, that has crept down another 9 houses, basically past Besson Street, all the way to Page Street. Just 2 years ago, 68 McClellan sold and became what's going to be a student rental. In response to that, 54 and 50 McClellan long-term residents have already left and are now renting there to students. 54 told me they're probably going to move too, because as Karen said, they're just in the middle of 100 students and it's unpleasant to live there. This is like, I think, one of the older streets in town. And it's the center, literally the center of our town. If we want people to move into town, we can't let this happen everywhere. We can't have complete streets that are nothing but student rentals. There won't be a downtown. That's my view. Thanks.
Okay. Lawrence.
I'm conflicted, and so I would welcome the opportunity to hear a little bit more, because I know some of these discussions predate my time on the planning board too. But I'm very sympathetic to the position that Jesse and Karen have described here. I mean, I think I think we all agree that dealing with this is an important issue. It's an important issue for the future of the town. Personally, I am conflicted about the proposed definition of a student house, because I'm concerned that it creates, in the context of our town, it makes a lot of sense, but on its face, somewhat arbitrarily, a separate class of individuals just based on what they are pursuing in their lives. This is kind of reductio ad absurdum, but you could imagine a situation in which there were a bunch of firefighters who chose to live together, and people didn't like that all hours of night they were having to run off to the fire station. And so there's some future restriction that, the town won't allow won't allow firefighters to live together. I know it's an absurd example, but it's on its face, outside of the context of what we're talking about here, no different than saying people who are attending undergraduate or graduate classes. So I just I'm just I'm really conflicted about this because I understand and am very sympathetic to the issue that you're describing, but I remain unconvinced and frankly a little concerned that the way to address this is to define sort of a new class of people in our town in this way. And I know that, you all rightfully have been very clear that, hey, this is not anti-student, this is pro-permanent resident. But even that question of permanent resident, I've lived in town for almost 2 years now. I don't think I could describe myself as a permanent resident. I hope I'll be here for a while. But how do you define that? Are we trying to dissuade people who, may not be students, but may just want to live in Amherst for a couple of years? I worry a little bit about that approach to solving this problem, which I agree is something that needs to be solved. And I don't know if this is the appropriate time to raise it, but it's been eating at me, and I would appreciate, just a little bit more context about this before I support moving forward with asking the state for an exception.
All right, Lawrence. I will insert, I'm not opposed to asking for some clarification on this. I think that'd probably be a good thing, whether it's something we could do. And then once we know that, then we can argue about whether we should do it, and if we should do it, where we should do it, or where we should not do it. Because I think you could have a zone that had that requirement, and maybe have a zone that didn't. I don't know. I mean, I think there's different ways to think about how it might go forward. So Jesse, go ahead.
Thanks, Doug. Lawrence, to your point, couple thoughts. One is I agree in principle with exactly what you're saying. I would say, students are not a protected class. I know that's not the reason to do it, but that's just a fact. Many other populations are, as we all know. I would say I haven't been involved in this debate that long, a couple of years, but this has been a conversation for 30 years at least in the town. Nothing's happened ever for any kind of regulation, as far as I can tell. We who came up with this, largely I think thanks to Bruce, are leaning on other places that have faced similar problems. And this was the solution that had been put in place, seems to be somewhat effective, as far as we can tell, has withstood any legal challenges, if there were any, right? So that's why we landed in this direction. There were other possibilities talked about: minimum distance, numbers of unrelated people, different things like that, right? Each has their own problems. Each strategy has their own problems. How do you define a permanent resident? I don't think it's length of time. I think it's year-round occupancy is what we're talking about. Probably more than any number of years. Maybe we need to refer to it in that way. And really what I think it comes down to is good stewards of the property and the neighborhood. And I'm not saying all students are bad stewards. I'm not anti-student at all. But when you're only here 9 months of the year, you just can't be. You can't be a good steward of the community and the property and the neighborhood. I think it's very difficult. So that's why these are the things that help me be okay with this idea of defining this population.
All right, we'll move on to Johanna.
The biggest issue is that we have historically deferred building housing while the population at UMass has increased. And now, it's like gotten to the point where it's a crisis at the state level. So we're seeing state level policy come down. And I can't help but feel like we are like spending a bunch of time working on the minutia of something that will only moderately address the problem when we should be doubling down on our efforts to figure out where in town can we add housing to help alleviate some of the pressure on the neighborhoods that we do have. So, you know, I suppose, open to exploring this, but I feel like it's a distraction from the core policy work that we need to be doing as a planning board. Which is, if we need more housing in town, let's figure out where to make that happen with the least resistance and get it moving forward. I think, we've made some progress on University Drive, and I don't know, I can't help but feel like we're kind of like rearranging deck chairs when there's like we need to build another ship.
All right, Nate, you're next.
Sure, thanks. Johan, I agree. However, the state, promulgated the ADU legislation and regulations, and I think it's something that, a lot of communities are trying to figure out how to address. And so, for me, I think it's worth, I took some notes about what we would present if we wanted to with the state is, so we could have general requirements in a bylaw. One would be a student home definition. We ask for a parking management plan. I think we could limit the amount of parking spaces. So ironically, some places would actually require parking because then the lots aren't big enough that then they can't make the units. So that's why they have this provision where you can't require parking within a half mile of a transit station or stop. But we've talked about the concern of actually having too much parking. And so, the building commissioner wasn't sure about this, but at one point we talked about, could you try to limit the number of parking spaces for an ADU, because the regulations say you can't. So I consider having something like that in there. We have in our bylaw, we had, no separate driveway curb cut unless approved by Public Works. I don't think that's unreasonable. And so what I'd want to do is, come up with, say, a number of general requirements we think that could be part of a bylaw and send it to the state and just say, here's what we do. I think that given the rules and regulations, I feel like they clarified enough that, we can't, the bylaw we were working on previously, it's 4 pages or 3 pages. Like I said, I think over half of it is just now unnecessary. So I'd want to come up with, like, what are the general requirements? And at the same time, like, we were talking about, right, where else could we have housing and allow density? And so, we were talking about University Drive isn't done yet. It's going back to council, but we've talked about East Amherst or other places, and I think we need to continue to have those conversations. The market study mentioned, kind of allowing density in some areas and then maybe measures in other areas that, actually protect the neighborhood. So Gregor Shane, the housing planner, part-time planner, housing coordinator for the town, and I met with Lehigh graduate students and professors this week to talk about, they're looking at, they call them alley flats, but they're proposing something similar. And Pennsylvania is talking about maybe having an ADU legislation. So we met with them, and they, in Bethlehem, they have kind of a similar problem, but they have some areas now where they've zoned to allow for students. And then outside that, they limit it to 2 unrelated. And they've taken some pretty aggressive approaches to try to, manage student housing and other things. And, it's a different kind of planning context and, layout of the streets and neighborhood and everything. But it is interesting that they're representing a few other cities in Pennsylvania and towns that have colleges and universities. And so it was a great conversation. And so they see it as, right, they're trying to do many things at once, maybe a student boundary district, plus allow ADUs, plus allow dense development, plus, it's everything that we've probably been talking about. And they're also trying to figure out how many things can you prioritize and move forward at the same time.
Okay. Jesse, then Lawrence, and then Fred.
Thanks. Sorry, a couple other points I left out of the rationale, the motivation in my mind, which is also that sort of what makes a town long-term. It's families. Students don't bring children. They won't go to our schools. They don't use the public library. These are things we as a town just decided to invest tremendously in. Schools and libraries. right? They don't generally go shop downtown. They don't support the local restaurants, certainly not in summer, and shops. And so it's that holistic view that I'm thinking about. And Johanna, I agree that this is not the major goal, but I also feel like we have to take every opportunity we can to do what we can before it's too late, because it's a one-way decision. Now, I mean, I just got data from 20 years of sales in Amherst. I haven't quite gone through it all yet, but what I suspected was true. I can't find any examples of an LLC selling to a single owner. Not one. Once they go to a student rental owned by a management company, they are never returning unless UMass disappears. And that's probably unlikely. I'll be out of a job because I'll disappear too. So that, but I think that's what's motivating me.
All right, Lawrence, you're next.
Yeah, I guess first of all, I really appreciate the background and the context is really helpful as I think and learn about these things. I guess my question is, does the board need to take action in this instance in terms of a vote, or is Nate sort of empowered to move forward with getting more information?
Nate, what do you think?
Yeah, what I'd want to do is come up, like I said, with a set of general requirements we'd have. I just added one, a property management plan, and bring it back to the board. Could be at the next meeting and say, here's what I think would be the number of conditions we'd want to apply to the protected ADUs, and then we would you have one more discussion and then send it to the state. And so and you can always email me, individual members, if you have ideas. I mean, if you want to search the internet and say, oh, looks like this community is doing this. I mean, I'll do a little bit of that too, talk to staff. Like I said, it's, I feel like we're kind of limited because the way the, updated regulations, state regulations are really clear about kind of design standards and other things. So for instance, we had a provision that said, like, basically you couldn't have an ADU in the front yard. And now they're saying, well, you can't do that. You can't kind of have that standard except in a local historic district. But I don't know. I mean, so it's it's like, okay, well, then do we still try to have it and ask that? I mean, it seems like they're just gonna say no. We clearly here's where we say we can't. But in our bylaw we had looked at a few months ago, we had a number of these kind of standards and conditions, to me, that are no longer relevant or applicable because they're inconsistent with the regulation. So, if there's things that members think about after tonight, you can email me and then I can look into it and include it or not for the next meeting, and have, like I said, a number of conditions that we would send to the state and say, here's, I guess I'd phrase it as, here's some context, and here's what we do is we'd create a definition in our bylaw, protected ADU, that meets the state, and then we just assign these general requirements that they'd have to meet. I don't think, we had said we don't want to allow more than one on a property, which you can if you want to do that, but we said we didn't want to do that. But if we wanted to, I think was at our discretion. And so really it would be, what are these other general requirements we think could be reasonable on ADUs?
Okay. Jesse.
Nate or anyone, do you know how we can get the language of the exemptions that were granted? Like how that process was and what the specifics were? Because I feel like that would really help us. I just don't know how to get that.
Yeah,
Well, somebody named a couple of towns. I would think some
Provincetown, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard is what
I
was
would
in the
think
paper.
the planning director in those towns, or maybe even their website, might list their bylaw if it's already posted.
Well, but I guess what I'm thinking is if the state granted an exemption, will all that language be public somewhere? I just don't know where to look.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the question. I'm talking about, a bylaw, but are we, would the board also want to look into an exemption? I mean, it's a different.
That's why I'm asking. It's like, I'd love to see that because I would think we could pursue that route also. And if it's not through the planning board, maybe we can talk to our representatives, you know, and like go after it that way at the same time, not instead of, but pursue all these options, like I just said.
All right, Nate, so can we assume you'll come back to us at the next meeting with something to suggest?
Yeah, I'll work on that.
Okay. Karen,
I have a question, Nate. When you were just talking to other towns about what they were doing, and you said that they pursued avenue of maybe having dense student population in one section and in another where only two unrelated people could live. I thought that we were no longer allowed to have, for example, 4 unrelated. Is this another state, or how come they can do that?
Yeah, it's another state. And even then, I mean, we still have the 4 unrelated in our zoning bylaw. It just becomes a difficult thing to enforce. So, you know, other states have different, you know, enabling legislation or laws that may allow it to be a little easier. Pennsylvania is one of them. So there's been a few examples from there, kind of mid-Atlantic. Other states do it as well.
Okay.
all right, any other comments on this from the board? All right, I'm gonna call on members of the public. If you have comments you want to contribute to this conversation, please raise your hand. Pam Field Sadler, can we bring Pam Rooney over? Give her her 3 minutes.
I do believe we can. Hi, Pam.
Hi, Pam.
Hello, Pam.
Pam.
Can you give us your give us again, and then tell us whether you're speaking as a counselor or as a private citizen.
A private citizen. Pam Rooney, 42 Cottage Street. I greatly appreciate this conversation. It just makes me want to sit on the planning board and be part of this conversation in real life. A couple things are going through my head. The conversation about students being somehow a protected class and categorizing them as such needs to be debunked. We are, in fact, really strongly trying to support a community that is year-round residents. And so all of these actions are in support of leaving homes available essentially for year-round residents to occupy. I appreciate and support the idea of restricting, if we can go that route, 1 of 2 units. If you have an ADU, that it is 1 is for students and 1 is not. I don't believe it's and if we apply a term student home to a unit, I think that's a perfectly viable strategy in town. State College does that, and it allows them to, in fact, be more efficient in their regulations. If we name it, it doesn't mean that we're restricting, we're just naming it. And if only 1 of the 2 units can be a student unit, that I think is really important. I would love to see us reach out to find out what Nantucket, what the exemptions were that Nantucket and Provincetown got. I think that's very important. And then lastly, just thinking about reasonable regulation, which I think the state bylaw gives us the opportunity for. And since we do have a cap of 4 unrelated people in our zoning bylaw, then I want us to be able to at least pursue the 3 or 4 in an ADU because of the size. The other reasonable regulations would be, I feel that, you know, the basic conditions that we already have, that it kind of fits in the neighborhood, that it is compatible with essentially the architecture of the existing house, That does not seem to be
Yeah,
unreasonable.
15 seconds.
Thank you. I'm done.
Okay, all right,
Thanks for
Okay.
letting me speak.
certainly. Okay, Pam Field Sadler, why don't we bring over Janet Keller?
Hi, Janet.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to comment. I urge you to consider adopting the Housing Subcommittee recommendation that only one of the two units can be student housing or something in that. I mean, you've discussed a lot of things, so these are comments that I wrote before you started your very robust discussion. And for looking ahead to the general housing discussion, I urge you to return footnote M to the original dimensions of 6,000 square feet for additional units in the RG zone in order to decrease density and retain the character there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Janet. I don't see any other hands from the public. All right, any last comments from the board on this topic? I think we're almost at 8 o'clock, so we'll take our 5-minute break once we've run out of things to say about this. I don't see any hands from the public and none from the board. So Nate, well, you've got your charge to put together some reasonable conditions or whatever we want to call them on our proposal. And we'll see you next time, or we'll talk about them in the next meeting. Okay, the time is 7:53. 5 minutes from now, looks like 7:58. Folks, let's take our 5-minute break. Turn on your camera when you come back so that we know you are back. Thank you. All right, time is 7:59. Pam, I think we can turn the timer off, at least for a,
Yeah, I thought I did, but let me give it another
well, it's
try.
still running, but I'm still seeing it. We may need it later, but it's not a big problem.
I don't know.
All right, well, we'll stick with it. I assume you can still restart it if you need to.
Yeah, I mean, but before I've been able to take it away, but
Yeah,
tonight when I hit the X that says close, it continues to show here.
Hmm.
I don't know what that's about. Sorry, Mr. Marshall.
that's fine.
Okay,
Not a problem. All right, so we've got everybody but Nate back.
I did it.
There you go.
I did it, but I might not be able to get it back.
Oh, there's
Tip.
Nate. So, okay, so time now is 8 o'clock and the board has reconvened. We will continue the meeting. I believe we are up to item 5 in the agenda, which is general housing discussion. First topic within that general topic is footnote M discussion. So Jesse, I think you are the spokesperson for the proponents again, I think.
I suppose so, unless anyone else would like to volunteer. Um, okay, so hopefully you all had a chance to read the memo that Nate put together based on our discussion at the subcommittee. And just to briefly summarize, Fred Hartwell, our current member, was the originator of footnote M. I don't remember what year, apologies, Fred. And it was put in place to have a minimum square foot requirement of 6,000 feet in order to build an additional dwelling unit. That was approved by town meeting unanimously. In 2005, that 6,000 square foot requirement was reduced to 4,000 square feet and has been that way for the last 20 years. Some of the rationale for that was in this memo. We think it's now time to return to the original 6,000 square foot requirement. And the main rationale is because of the discussion we just had, frankly, because of the new ADU state law, which removes or does not allow an ADU to be part of the square foot calculation. Sorry. Yeah, you can't use an ADU as part of the calculation for an additional unit. Meaning, if you had a property with a house, they build an ADU, they want to build another unit, that's not calculated in the square footage as land, basically another dwelling already there. So it just would help us maintain, in our opinion, the density standards that have been in place for the last 20 years, even if we bump this up to 6,000, given the new ADU by right. Hopefully that was coherent.
Okay. All right, board members, comments? Bruce and then Lawrence.
I think it's worth going into the 2005 rationale a little bit, which was a rationale which was persuasive at the time at town meeting, I guess, but which seems specious, really, because I think Fred, I can't remember, Fred, whether you made this argument at this last meeting or whether you made it at the housing subcommittee meeting, but essentially the notion was that footnote M, as it originally was promulgated, created density limitations or a situation which limited the density potentially in the RG to a greater extent than it did in the outlying village center zones. And that seemed to people at the time, or the argument made that it should seem to that was kind of backwards, and that we shouldn't imagine that the outlying areas would have a greater density. Well, what wasn't made clear in that comment was that the outlying areas in the village centers where the density was possibly greater, potentially under the 6,000 footnote M requirement, very small patches of the town, and small patches in areas where larger densities was appropriate, and by comparison to the whole of the RG area, which is a much greater area, vast, comparatively vast, or comparatively significantly larger. And so the comparisons were specious because they were comparing smaller parcels with much bigger parcels in the center of town, and we thought, we being the housing committee, housing subcommittee, that argument that prevailed in 2005 should not have, and I think that's it from me for the moment.
All right, Bruce. Lawrence.
Yeah, that was really helpful and mostly answered my questions. I wanted a little bit more background on what the 2005 rationale was, but this is really helpful.
You have muted
You
yourself.
muted.
You muted.
Of course I did. Was I muted that whole time? Or
No.
Just when you said it
okay.
was very helpful.
Right. Yeah, the memo was very helpful. It sounds like Nate did the bulk of the drafting of that. So so thank you to whomever developed that. It was really helpful in understanding this issue.
Okay. Fred.
Yeah, one of the things that I would urge you all to look at is the write-up that Chris Brestrup did on the 1993 action in town meeting, which I brought the petition forward for. It's an incredibly detailed recounting of the history there, which frankly I had forgotten some of, and I was in the middle of it. There was an extraordinary amount of very careful research and discussion. The way I originally framed the petition was somewhat different, and the planning board looked at it and took it very seriously. And this is all written up in Chris's presentation. She did an excellent job. And when it came out the other end, the planning board supported it, town meeting supported it unanimously. Francesca Maltese, who was the moderator at the time, stepped down afterwards and came up to me and shook my hands and looked me in the eye and said, "You just saved the general residence zoning district." And in fact, that's how I got on the planning board the first time, because the very next morning, I had a phone call from the town manager's office. Can you come down to town hall and fill out an application? We're putting you on the planning board. That's actually how I got on the planning board the first time. But yeah, this has been very, very carefully looked at, and I urge all of you to go through Chris's report.
All right. Jesse. Jesse, you're muted.
Thank you. Just to add one more point, which are the last two bullets on page 2, if you've had a chance to look at it. hearkening back to the conversation that Johanna just brought up about our other conversation. The subcommittee didn't think this is the solution to this problem, but it feels like a small immediate change we can make, which will move us in the right direction. So I just wanted to make that clear also for the other members who were not part of that pretty lengthy discussion, that we do think with Nate's suggestion actually that there's time and room in the near future to really look at the whole zoning bylaw around density again and probably revamp. And this is just a small, quick action step we can take. That's all. Thanks.
Okay. Nate, do you and staff have an opinion about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a first step that, is part of a larger discussion we've had about what's appropriate density, say in the RG or other zoning districts. And so staff had looked at changing footnote M, in 2020, 2021. And we realized that it allows for quite a bit of density. Some of it is because the lot sizes and everything are not consistent in a uniform size, although we have a minimum lot size, the lots are a lot bigger. And so I think that, we've often talked about having, re-examining kind of what is the right density. And I think with the housing production plan underway and hopefully done this year in the next 6 to 8 months, we'll have some strategies in terms of, approaching that. And so I think this is a good first step. So for instance, when we had this meeting I mentioned with Lehigh and others, I said that Amherst zoning, right, for the longest time has not done a very good job of allowing like middle density, say 3 to 10 units or 5 to 12 units. It's, 3 units and above is an apartment building. And then we regulate everything really heavily in 1 and 2 units. So, what we've seen, right, over time, and it was partly because UMass expanded back in the late 60s, were these apartment complexes. And then we changed zoning and said, no, those can't happen anymore. And then we didn't really change zoning very much for 40, 50 years. And then we changed it in the 2000s and 2000 teens. But what we didn't allow, like we don't allow cottage style development. We've never been really good at saying we could have 5 units on a property and here's how. And so I think if we want to have infill development that is appropriate, in my mind, the footnote change is one way to do it. And I think we would then look at it and actually have a better density formula or calculation that would apply. And I think that's a much bigger study. But I think for now, when Fred talked about how they researched what the right amount would be, 6,000 seemed to work. And I could see it as part of a strategy that the 2015 Comprehensive Housing Market Study said is that, I don't want to say de-densify, but let's have some controls in residential neighborhoods, and then let's have other areas where we allow greater density like we did on University Drive. So again, I think it's, a balancing act of having a few different things moving forward at the same time. So while we're talking about the footnote M, we could also talk about the apartment complex overlay or East Amherst, and we're, kind of championing a few different strategies.
Okay. Any other comments on this from the board at the moment? I'll go to the public.
Oh, sorry,
I'm sorry, Nate, go ahead.
I was just going to mention too that the footnote M, what it really applies to is just townhouses and apartments, and the way those are permitted are still by special permit. The way we've interpreted our bylaw now in terms of having multiple single family homes or duplexes in a property is different than it was previously. So, I think the change is something that the board can discuss and could be a proponent of. And like I said, and then there's, other ideas that would probably, be discussed as well. But I just want to, it's not to me as if it's, we still have our permitting paths in our residential use classifications, right? It's not changing any of that. It's really this additional lot area per unit.
So do you think this is consequential and it's worth our time? Because I'm not sure what actual problem we're trying to solve by doing this.
Yeah, I think what, there's been a few properties that were looked at, like I said, given their size and their location, the RG, through the zoning, they could end up having, 6 or 8 units, and it's more than probably what some were expecting could happen on a property. And so, sometimes having just this, a smaller lot area per additional unit, you know, you might look at a few and say, oh, that looks pretty good. But then, you know, because we're not on a grid system and not every lot is a uniform, 120 by 200 or whatever it is, I'm getting these, there's probably more lots that can have greater density than might be originally anticipated. So, I do think that it would, I think it would help. I think, as Jesse mentioned too, with the ADUs now, they're not counted towards the density calculation, so they don't factor in this formula.
Okay, Jesse.
To your question, Doug, I would offer it's worth our time here because it would save lots of time with some of the recent examples that have gone to the local historic district committee, to the zoning board, and been rejected multiple rounds. So it would prevent some of those proposals by density. And so think about the amount of time was spent, A, by the designers and the owners, by the town committees, to then get to the result of, no, we don't think this is appropriate. And so it restores some of that. So I think on balance, it's probably time saver.
Okay. All right, Johanna.
We may not have the answer to this, but I'm curious do we have a sense of how many lots in town this applies to? And like what the shift in potential unit generation would be? Like, would it be from 200 units down to 50 units? I feel like I vaguely remember the planning staff doing some of this work a couple of years ago.
Nate?
Yeah, I don't have those. I think we could revisit what was done, and then come up with some other, maybe some change in build out. But I don't have that now. And I think the thought was that this would apply. I was thinking it was only in the RG district, and so it's not anywhere else, and like it applies to just two uses, apartments and townhouses. So, when we had done our density calculations previously in RG, I think we were working under the assumption that you could have multiple duplexes on a property, which is now not allowed. And so, the difference being, at that point we could have said, oh, well, here's an acre property, you could put 6, or 4 duplexes and get 8 units. And now we're saying we don't allow that. So you'd have to do it through an apartment building, which, is allowed. It's a different permitting. It's maybe the same permitting, but the construction of an apartment building triggers sprinklers and other things that say single family homes and duplexes don't. So I feel like it's a hard thing to say, well, we've just reduced this kind of build out potential because, the construction methods and some of the code requirements are different that impact it. I mean, granted, it would reduce it, but I don't know, to what magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Fred.
Yeah, again, Joanna, if you look at the history that Chris put together, I don't know if you I think that was circulated to the board. Was it?
I think it only went to the housing subcommittee. We can send
It
that.
may have just gone to the housing subcommittee. In that case, never mind. It should probably go to the planning board, but anyway.
Nate, is that something you could circulate to the rest of us?
Yes, yep.
That'd be great, because we got the memo for the meeting, but we didn't get the backgrounder. So that'd be great.
All right, members of the public, any of you want to comment on this? Why don't you raise your hands while we listen to Bruce?
Just suggesting perhaps that in addition to Chris's memo, I thought there was one memo that also could be added. I think, as I recall, the housing subcommittee, Nate, you gave us 6 or 7 files. Chris's memo was one of them. It does a fine review of the 1993 situation, but then it moves and it says, I still have to research the reasons for the reversion in 2005. Now, maybe there's a more recent version of Chris's memo that moves forward on that. But there is also the planning board report of a town meeting, which gives the reason why the 2005 change was made. And I briefly summarized it earlier. But if you're sending stuff to us, I think of the 7 things you sent, Chris's memo, but I would add the planning board report from 2005 to town meeting relative to that warrant article would be also helpful to include. I would suggest both of those 2 files go.
Okay. Pam, you had your hand up briefly. Was that a mistake?
That was a mistake. Thank you for asking.
Okay. And I haven't seen any hands from the public go up while we listened to Bruce. So I guess at the moment I will assume there are no public comments on this. So what would be the next step? Nate, you'll send the rest of us some information, and we'll take this up at a future meeting?
Yeah, I already sent it just a few seconds ago. So,
Oh, good. I'm ready to look at it.
yeah, read it tonight, please. No, I think, yeah, we can pick it up at another meeting. I think if there's other questions that you'd want staff to look into, Johanna, I think your question about, change in development potential, if there's other things, you can email them to staff after this meeting, and we can come prepared to have another discussion. And if the board, wants to discuss it or thinks it's something to move forward, I'd want to. It's a simple change, and so we could just send it to council and have it be referred back to planning board and CRC, or we could try to get in front of the CRC before it goes to council and say, here's what we've been thinking about, just so they, have a preview of it before it becomes, kind of a zoning referral.
Well, we've got 2 of them in the audience, so.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the more important piece with this would be kind of the rationale and context, right? I think that what it's doing is easy to understand, as opposed to say like the U-Drive overlay, which is pages of new information. This is something that is straightforward, and then it's really about the explanation. And so I don't think it's a heavy lift necessarily. I think it might generate discussion though.
Jesse?
Thanks. Trying to respect those of you who are not at the subcommittee meeting and that you haven't had all the information. I don't want to make a motion, but I think I'm going to make a motion because it's clearly going to come back anyway. Meaning, if we vote and we move it forward to council, it's going to come back to CRC and back to us for public hearing, right? So there's plenty more time for discussion, and I feel fairly confident those of us who are going to vote to move this forward, our opinions are not going to change. I would vote to move it forward 2 weeks from now also. So I'm going to move that we, whatever the right language is, adopt this change in footnote M and move it to council for consideration.
Okay. Karen?
I second.
All right, any discussion? Bruce?
I think I would support this motion. The only reason that I would be hesitant in supporting this motion is that I wouldn't want to feel that because there are 4 of us on the housing committee and 7 on the board, that those of us that have had this more fulsome discussion might believe that we know what we're doing and then would force a vote through the planning board. And that doesn't feel right. And I don't think it feels right to Jesse either, except what does feel right, I think, to both of us is that this is such a small thing and it feels like we should just get on with it. And that would be why I would vote for it. And why I wouldn't vote for it would be what I just said. And since you're probably going to ask me to vote first, can we go backwards?
Yeah, I can start with Karen.
Uh,
She seconded
I
it.
vote aye.
Well, we're not voting yet.
Oh,
Yeah, I guess I will say that I'm starting to feel a little bit I don't know what verb to use, but having
About
four of you-
how about railroaded?
railroaded was the first thing that came to mind. Yeah. You know, having four of you in a separate subcommittee meeting and then showing up with a majority in favor of something does feel a little bit like, what's the point of having a planning board meeting when, you know, the decision happened in subcommittee. So I am feeling that way, and I'm not happy about it. I also I still don't really understand what the problem is that this would solve. So you know, having the historical local district commission shoot down a you know, a project that would have built more units in town, you know, it's not obvious to me that the problem was that the project got too far. The possible problem was that the historical commission didn't want to have more housing in town, and that's, to me, a problem. So I think I have a kind of a fundamental difference of opinion about, frankly, how neighborhoods around the university should or shouldn't be allowed to evolve. And I realize that Jesse and maybe Karen live in those neighborhoods. My neighborhood is one of them too. And I think I'm a little less sentimental about the value of the existing neighborhood layout, I guess I'd say, than many other people in town. So perhaps that's just me in the minority. But you know, I'm not particularly happy with where we're at, but I recognize that the majority of the folks on the committee probably want to proceed with this. And I mean, I have one question for Nate, which is, do we need to have had any more public advertisement, or did this need to be any more defined on the agenda in order for us to move this to town council? Or can we just go ahead with this now?
Yeah, the planning board's allowed to sponsor a zoning amendment, you know, by statute and local and charter.
Right.
I'd have to verify. I don't think we have any other prescribed process in our rules and regulations for that.
Okay, so we can go ahead with this.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I was going to say, Doug, I think for the housing subcommittee and, you know, you know, and for the planning board, you know, my hope would be that once the housing production plan is done, that provides some framework. And so then the planning board can provide, you know, the whole board can provide guidance to the housing subcommittee in terms of, say, priorities, or things to look at, or say, here are the few, you know, maybe ideas to look at, right? So is it, you know, the apartment complex overlay is something the board's discussed and it's on the agenda next. Does the housing subcommittee then really work on that and then bring it back to the board? Or are there, you know, general things that the housing subcommittee would look at, like the RG or, you know, whatever? And so, you know, I think we can provide direction to the housing subcommittee. I mean, I don't necessarily see the harm in waiting if we want the rest of the board members to read what was submitted, right? I just emailed it, you know, tonight.
Okay. All right, fine. Lawrence, and then Karen, and then Jesse.
Yeah, I was just because I understand the urgency. I understand that there's a majority that wants to move forward with this. I'm actually, like, my inclination would be toward supporting the change, but I don't love having to vote on something that some folks on the board have background on that I haven't had access to. So for that reason, kind of in principle, I'm going to vote against the motion to advance it. But, you know, I'm very open-minded and maybe even inclined to vote differently when it comes back to us, which it sounds like it will.
Okay, Karen?
So I think, Doug, I think that if you had been part of the whole long complicated historical commission review of that particular project, you would have probably, thanks, you would have, you would feel differently. I don't think that we think that our neighborhood is especially precious. I think there were so many people that called in, and there was a realtor that said, if this happens here, I can guarantee you that I won't be able to sell another single family house in the center of town. So there
Mhm.
were a lot of things that caused us to be really alarmed here. And I think as far as the subcommittee goes, we maybe didn't make, we weren't able to explain exactly well enough to those of you that haven't spent as much time as we have on this, why this is a little step that we think we should do right now. And it's really only because it's not because we don't think that the whole downtown should be looked at more carefully and have, you know, proper density put in some of the big lots. We agree with this, but we want to preserve a living space for people that are not students, and that is really in danger if we're not careful. And with the ADU thing being sort of pushed by the state right now, the whole density thing is a little bit out of our control. If we don't take some precautions right now. And that's why we want to make this a little bit of an urgency to have that footnote M back in place. That gives us more time to be able to then assess how can we rezone the center of town so we do in fact get more density, but we do it in a way that doesn't mean that there's going to be just flight of everyone that's living here and no longer a town of Amherst. So, you know, it's just that we've spent so much time in the details and we weren't able to communicate it perhaps as well as we should have. So I'm sorry, we don't want to railroad you.
Thank you, Karen. Jesse,
Thanks. So if we can bring this back in 2 weeks, I'm going to withdraw my motion out of respect for this fact that you all have not had time to absorb the other background material. I don't, you know, that was my hesitation in the first place, recognizing the 4 of us are the majority of the board. But I would like to then discuss this a little further as a board, meaning provided all the information were provided, things that come out of the subcommittee, I do feel like should be able to be discussed and voted on
oh yeah,
if there's adequate time, right? And again, I recognize that you didn't get it, so fine. It's not my intention to have no discussion and move things forward. To Nate, and also I just want to clarify something you just said about the subcommittee. Were you suggesting that the full board should then tell the subcommittee what topics to work on?
Yeah, I mean, if Doug's, you know, so typically a subcommittee would be formed to, you know, further work of the planning of a board that they don't have time to do at the regular meetings. And so, you know, I think the housing subcommittee has been discussing a number of different housing things when we bring it back to the planning board. But it could be that the planning board discusses as a whole what they think the housing subcommittee could spend their time researching, whether it's, you know, like this density thing in the RG, or is it different zoning amendment, or, you know, like I said, I think the housing production plan is going to have a number of goals and strategies. And I think the housing trust is going to look at some, and I think there will be some that are more squarely for the planning board. And I think the board could say, we really like this idea of, say, this development method. And it could ask the housing subcommittee to research it and then bring it back to the board. And so there's a different ways that a subcommittee can operate. And so in other boards and committees I've worked on, you know, it can be really specific, task driven, or it's just general, you know, look at housing and come back to us with ideas, or we want you to look at these 3 zoning possibilities and then come back to us. So it's,
I mean,
you know, I think there's different ways to manage it.
from my own perspective, I think topic suggestions, we'd like you to work on this issue are great, but I wouldn't enjoy it if it were restricted to those topics and suggestions. I feel like I was encouraged to try and form this subcommittee so that we could think broadly about the housing situation, which those of us on the subcommittee are very passionate about, which is obvious in our recent discussions. And so I would not want to be restricted to certain topics. So I hope that's not what we're talking about.
All right. Any more? So, Jesse, you have withdrawn your,
Correct. I withdraw the vote, and I hope we can bring it back in 2 weeks.
all right. Any further discussion of that topic? All right. All right, we'll move on to the potential overlay for existing apartment complexes. Nate, or Jesse, has that been discussed in the housing subcommittee at all?
We discussed it very briefly, but Nate suggested to be on the agenda tonight, so we really didn't get any further than we were last time.
All right. Well, Nate, do you want to say anything more about it before we open the discussion? I guess it's 8:35, so I don't know if anybody's starting to wear down and whether we want to have a long conversation tonight or not.
Yeah, I haven't, I emailed a few things around at one point, some of the historical stuff. We had talked about North Amherst. I think there's been some discussion about whether or not North Amherst is the appropriate place. And so, beyond that, I haven't. I think, I've just been working on the University Drive, so I just submitted the memo to council today. I was at CRC, so that's been kind of the priority to move the University Drive overlay. The apartment complex, I haven't, I listened a bit to the housing forum the other week in Amherst, and they mentioned, why does the town not have a 40R, or could we do other things? It's interesting. I feel like if we allow this apartment complex overlay, if we had it established, say it was by site plan review with design standards and conditions, it really functions as a 40R, even though we don't call it that. And so I think it's again, it's an opportunity for something to happen. It may or may not be realized, right? So just like the overlay, it's providing an opportunity in the hope that it will have something will happen. And so, as I mentioned, I just think we should start small in a discrete area. And previously, I think it was going to be like this blanket overlay over every property that had a certain number of multi-unit buildings or something. And I don't think that should be how we approach it. It could be that North Amherst has some standards or conditions that are different than other parts of town. And so I think some of it would be really, someone had mentioned maybe East Hadley Road. I just would want to say, are we sure about North Amherst? And then, what do we think is the right density? The market study said 4 to 5 times what's there just to incentivize redevelopment. And so, I was driving around town the other day and I'm like, in North Amherst, 3 stories along the road, maybe 4 and back. I mean, what's the right height and density? Do we, really want to encourage certain design forms, or or is it pretty minimal in terms of how we allow it, but we have, a few provisions about what kind of density we want, and then it's really up to a developer to propose it. I mean, I guess that's some of the questions, like how prescriptive and detailed we want certain things, or it's going to be really flexible.
So board members, how do you feel about that? Do you want to prescribe very much, or, is that area of north of the campus where there's like 2 and 3 story apartment buildings now, is it sort of out of sight and out of mind? It's not part of downtown. Doesn't really contribute to the sort of self-image of the town. Do we care? Lawrence?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was looking at the packet. Candidly, I don't feel super well equipped to have this discussion right now. Like I'm not sure I have enough of the background at hand to, well, I probably don't contribute constructively to many of our conversations, but particularly in this instance, like I don't know. I mean, could we? And I know we had this came up at a previous meeting, and there were some materials that were shared around as you noted, Nate. But could we maybe, reshare around the resources and have a deeper conversation at a future point?
I think I saw Nate nod his head, yes. I suppose, Nate, you probably could just tell us which meeting the materials were shared in, and we could just get them off the town website.
Yeah, I'll send things around again, probably this evening, and I think this will be more than a one meeting conversation. Say, I just, for instance, when I mentioned the 40R, the idea is we looked at it for downtown, and the idea is you'd allow, you'd upzone an area to incentivize development. It could be by site plan review. There's an affordable component in 40R, and then there's some design standards, but it's pretty loose, right? So you might end up getting a building. For instance, you might think that, oh, we're going to get flat roof buildings and they're going to look like this. But then all of a sudden you might get a modern building and you might be like, oh, that's not what we thought about. But, you have to allow, because it's site plan review, and you allow for that flexibility in design and architecture and everything. And so, with this overlay, it's, that's kind of the question with this apartment complex overlay. Are we going to get down to, some really strict design standards or building massing standards or things? Or are we just going to say, maybe it's a few different things as it gets closer to North Pleasant Street, if it's in North Amherst or Meadow Street, and the rest is really, the internal parts of the site is really, it's up to the developer. Like, we don't have much lot coverage or dimensional standards. It's just really flexible, and the town would, and permit granting authority, would respond to proposals. We're not going to say, like, you have to have this much open space or this or parking. It's just, a really flexible development tool.
You also talked about the affordable unit ratio that a 40R would come with. And I guess, are we thinking about this as a general housing area or student housing area? In which case, I'm not sure the affordable ratios are really applicable if we want to put students in the whole thing, So that's another question we should talk about.
Yep.
Johanna.
Thanks. Doug, you took some of the ideas out of my mind, but I was just looking at the map of, for example, the presidential apartments and like the North Village Drive and the Puffton Village area. And, I know there are some people there who are not students, but I think, the vast majority of the people who live in those developments are students right now, and the prospect of having them go from, relatively spread out, low slung, single story, or maybe in some cases 2-story townhouse style to denser, seems like you keep the students housing where the student housing is. I think that would be desirable. Add a bunch of density there, add a bunch of units, that alleviates pressure on the neighborhoods. And then it seems like, I don't know, I'm not an architect or a developer, but it seems like the fewer conditions we put on it, the more it increases the likelihood that maybe a developer steps up to redevelop one of those areas. Is that accurate? So we would want to figure out, okay, what's our, if the primary objective is to generate housing, what are kind of the baseline standards that we would want that housing to meet, rather than trying to be too prescriptive about it in a way that we might be for an area that's like on the town common or really like in the heart of downtown.
Yep. Bruce and then Jesse.
I substantially agree with you, Johanna. Just for those of you that may not know, which maybe nobody, I do live in this part of town and I drive around it, see it fairly regularly. The part that we've been discussing mostly, the Puffton Brandywine townhouse and maybe a little further up towards residential, is really rather secluded. It's got a bunch of old houses along North Pleasant Street, which screen essentially the housing to the west. From at the other end of it, there's the 116 and wetlands and so forth. So there's nothing from that end. The most conspicuous aspect of this consolidation of apartment developments is on Meadow Street. And that's where you see townhouse apartments. And I think probably if any one of you have seen Townhouse, you could probably agree that it's probably the ugliest development that you've ever seen anywhere in your life. And almost anything, I dare say, anything would be an improvement aesthetically on the townhouse. So if we went in with absolutely no standards at all, my guess is that there would be a net improvement. Doesn't mean we should completely void our interest or whatever, but some people might see responsibility. But Johanna, I agree, the bar is pretty low. This is definitely not downtown, and it's definitely not a historic district. And it's not seen except, as I say, townhouse, and God would I like to see the end of that. So I think we can approach this overlay or this area, an overlay in this area with what I've said in mind. I could say other things, but I think for the moment, that's the point that I will make for the moment.
All right. Couple of things come to mind. One is, would we include Hobart Lane on the east side of North Pleasant Street? I know that's been traditionally a pretty heavily student occupied area, and I don't know if there's other parts north or south of that. The other is I would probably start with some sort of height limitation. I can imagine most of you wouldn't want to see a 20-story tower there, but maybe I'm wrong. Jesse.
Thanks, Doug. I largely agree.
Whoops, you just muted.
Largely agree with what's been said. I was gonna add a couple of points to consider. I think these properties are pretty deep, and that's why they're largely not seen from North Pleasant Street. I mean, going east-west, there's a lot of land. So I could imagine being not very prescriptive at all, except saying, okay, a very generous setback. You can be 1 or 2 stories maybe, and then beyond that up to whatever we decide, 5 or 6 stories. And I think that would achieve the kind of density we're talking about. I also feel like there's opportunity to potentially require some mixed use on North Pleasant Street, which I think would be a positive for the residents there and other town members potentially. I don't, again, it's up to, and I would love to let the developers be creative and figure out their solutions. I don't know that would have to be the full 75% like we're talking about in University Drive, but I do feel like there's some opportunity there. At the same time, I'm a little torn because I'm not sure how well the North Amherst Center stores are doing.
Yeah, I mean, didn't we want to encourage the commerce in that center, in that village center, I guess?
But I don't know that I would take away from it. I think it's a combination of the right kind of places is my own personal thought. But anyway, that's a different debate. I was also gonna not make a motion, but ask maybe the planning board wants to ask the subcommittee next week when we meet, because I don't think we'll be talking about footnote M or about ADUs, since I think we're moving those along, to take on this issue and bring back some recommendations for our next discussion. I think we could accomplish that.
Jesse, I second your informal motion.
Yes. Oh, sorry, I left out one.
Non-motion.
I left out I left out one piece mostly for Lawrence, but really for all of us. When I first joined the board a year and a half ago, that's when we had those couple of in-person meetings, and I did find that exercise of all looking at a map together and talking about these places very useful. So I think it would be great for us to do that again, even if it's just 5 minutes, not in person, but on this format, just to look at the map, have Nate or someone else talk us through each of the districts we're talking about, just to get us all back on the same page. I think that would be beneficial.
All right. Nate, can you give us a plan or a map markup at some point?
Yeah, and I think based on the conversation tonight, there could be a document next time with some dimensional standards, and between the U-Drive overlay, the BL overlay that was proposed a few years ago, and some other things, I think staff could come up with a draft of something.
Would you rather do that, or would you want the housing subcommittee to talk about that?
I think they can talk about it too next week. It'll help that conversation.
Okay. Yeah, but I think a map with boundaries, that might be useful. Okay.
Yeah, I can say, yeah, I'm looking at the map as you're talking, so it's probably unfair that I, for people who aren't familiar, I'm on my Amherst maps right now on my other screen and looking, so.
Yeah, well, my internet pipe is too small to do too many things at once. Bruce,
One other thing that we might want to reflect on, I think I raised this with you, Nate, or maybe it was at the end of the housing subcommittee meeting, and it was something that my wife drew to my attention. We do talk about things occasionally, and it being in this end of town, and she's pretty active interest in this part of town with the District 1 Neighborhood Committee and so forth. She pointed out that how these housing developments have they been condominiumized, she said. Because I thought, oh, that's an interesting question. We, of course, at University Drive, we're talking about parcels that are essentially under one ownership, and they would be purchased and something would happen and so forth. But it turns out, as because Mary goes and figures things out a little bit further, and she tells me that she thinks that there's some degree of condominiumization of townhouse, but probably not at Puffton or Brandywine. And of course, given that townhouse is the bane of my, well, it's not the bane of my existence, but if anything was going to change up there, I would love it first to be townhouse, of course, when this can be wishful, thoughtful, and all that sort of business. But it does seem that we should be mindful, or at least informed about that fragmentation of ownership and title, and how likely how difficult it is to imagine something in the overlay being redeveloped if it's got a fragmented title. Because I imagine that what would have to happen, that there would be aggregation of title before something could happen. So that would mean, back to Johanna's point, that the fewer restrictions and the maximum incentives would be necessary to override or to overcome that kind of initial inertia. Because of course, with fragmentation, you get this potentially invidious situation where you get holdouts and things like that. And I think any developer who's thinking of consolidating title and so forth is ever aware of that. And it may be a reason why they wouldn't do it unless the incentive or the payout was potentially really handsome. So that was an observation brought to my attention by Mary, in which I talked to Nate about last week, and I relay. We haven't discussed it. It's really just an observation that can be confirmed and or quantified. But it does seem to be an issue for us to consider, or that would an issue that would affect the likely outcome and what we're trying to achieve.
well, I mean, wouldn't that show up on the property card for those properties? I guess, first of all, I've never seen that on any of those property cards. I can also say I've had some interaction with several of those properties, and none of the ones I've interacted with had any evidence of condominialization. But that's just my experience. Nate, would it show up on the property card if there were multiple owners in that way?
Yeah, I do think townhouse has been condominiumized with different owners. The rest of them appear to be under, the property still as, one owner. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think then the condo association would have to vote or something. But again, could a developer who sees an opportunity, manage that? And I'd say probably. It's just, it does add a little bit of complexity to it. I think when staff looked at this, 10 years ago, some of the reason was we were hearing that the apartment, the owners and managers were saying the apartments are in need of capital improvements, and, is it the right time? And so I think it's still the right time for some of them, and some of them have already started doing work on them. And so it's like, I feel like if we wait 10 more years, they'll already have spent a fair amount of money to put, new roofs and siding and everything, then they won't really it'll be a little more expensive or difficult to change. So I still think it's something that's worth pursuing. And if we find that North Amherst is complicated, is there other areas that we could, adapt our thinking to? But we can focus on this one first. And
Okay. Johanna,
Thank you. Doug, when you mentioned Nate showing some maps of where this might be affected, made me think like once there are maps, then things can start to feel real. And I wanted to just quickly ask what the process is for just like engaging the public and engaging abutters and neighbors and stakeholders in the process. I mean, we have these public hearings and I know, the agenda gets posted, but is there anything beyond that for, in particular, like the folks who live in that area?
Nate,
Yeah.
what kinds of things can we initiate?
yeah, I mean, if for instance, the board would like to pursue this and we're at a point where we could, mail, we don't typically, but we could mail property owners or abutters and say, here's what we're thinking. We could have a specific meeting addressed to this where, it's advertised, we welcome public comment. And so, we could call it a forum or a meeting, but right, I mean, there's different ways to do it. I think with the University Drive overlay, when we did hold our hearings, I mailed all the property owners the notification and the memo. Again, we don't usually do that for a zoning change. I do think this is a little bit bigger. So yeah, I mean, there's different ways to ask for public input. And so, for this kind of thinking, it could be that we spend time doing that. I guess some of it would be, if there is opposition, does the board still think it's an opportunity or a priority to pursue, right? And so, I'm assuming some people won't like the idea. And so, is it that, part of the bigger goal of, say, the town's comprehensive housing policy, the master plan and other things is here's where, there's this might be an appropriate area to increase density. And so, even if it's not a popular idea, would the board still want to pursue it? And so someone would be like, if we're doing this, do we frame it and say, here's why, provide some context, are there things you do, if this happens, are there things you would like to see or things you don't want to see? And sometimes I feel like having some framework is better than just saying, we're thinking about this, what do you think? So maybe, if we want to engage the public, if we spend some time talking about it, we can think of kind of, like I said, some framework to gather opinions. And maybe it is maps, maybe it's images or research in terms of where it's been done, and kind of guide them a little bit more than just asking like, what do you think of this idea? We could help them understand it more. And
Okay. Nate, one other thing comes to mind, and that is, is there a point at which we would run up against a limit on the water treatment plant to process sewage from a lot more people in town? At what point is that, we could upzone everything to 20 stories and, 1,000 people per lot, but at some point that's an issue that the town would need to think about. And are we anywhere near that, or is it just not something we need to worry about?
yeah, I haven't heard that we're nearing it, but I think, it has been asked in other situations. And so, when we had a pretty extreme drought a few years ago, there was considerations about, okay, what, if this becomes a more regular pattern, what does that mean for, our drinking water and wastewater and our public, infrastructure? But I think, our system has capacity. So I don't know. I can verify that with Public Works, but I know the system has a lot of capacity. I mean, I think part of the conversation is too, like I said, I don't think Amherst can solve the housing problem for the region. And so, some of it would be if we think we like this idea of North Amherst, I think, having a discussion about what we think is appropriate density and, that could be part of the overlay, whether it's a square foot calculation or unit calculation, because I do think that, UMass is, our housing consultants for the housing production plan UMass is starting to collect kind of more granular data in terms of off-campus students since the pandemic. And so we have some of that. And, like we've said, it's thousands of students. And so I'm not expecting that, between North Amherst and University Drive, we're going to somehow alleviate, the pressure of a few thousand students, but maybe we can help. And maybe there's other, like I said, if it's not Amherst, is there Hadley or other communities, is there discussions with UMass? Like I said, they're putting out that RFP. So, I would want to make sure that people aren't thinking like, wow, we're proposing Southwest Towers in North Amherst. Like, that's not my vision. Maybe the planning board or others might think that's okay, but I'm not envisioning, really, something like that there. Or maybe someone's like, wow, that's a great idea. We could actually do it. We could solve it. We could put 5,000 people really nicely, and wow, it's a, there's our silver bullet. I don't know. I'm not there yet, but maybe board members or others might be. But, I'm just trying to think like, okay, if it's 1 and 2 stories now and we can get up to 4 stories, that's double the density, but there's a lot of, kind of unused space, right? So it's like, I feel like you could, even with only 2 stories, you could double the density because of the layout of the site planning wasn't great. And if you allow 4 stories and better site planning, you could, maybe triple or quadruple the density and not really, have such a huge development. But I guess that's something, once we look at maps and have conversations, board members could weigh in on.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting question. What's a couple more towers? Bruce.
Yeah, I meant to say this earlier. It seems that this overlay, we don't necessarily have to have it a mixed use, do we? Could it not be apartments? Because we talked about apartments at University Drive, and there was a reason why many of us, all of us to some degree, I think, felt that life on the street, commercial activity generating same and such was important down there. But I think it's absolutely not important at all in the part of town that we're thinking of. And number 2, and related to that, what you said, Doug, or someone said, there's considerable retail development in North Amherst that is could benefit from an added market. So instead of thinking of 4 stories as 3 floors of residential and 1 of business, I would think that it would be all residential, and maybe it's 5 or 6. Or maybe it's a mix of that, and some way we could get a variation, which would be nice. But nonetheless, I think that apartments would be the type of use that would probably be best suited in the area we're talking about.
All right, Jesse.
Thanks. Yeah, I was also just looking at a map and listening, and thanks, Nate. It never occurred to me to put a huge tower there. I got to consider that now. I mean, in all seriousness, there might be opportunity towards the west of those long lots to have, more than we've been talking about. I don't know. I don't think a 20-story tower, but it does seem like, I don't know, 6 to 8 stories could fit nicely tucked away in there, and almost no one would ever see it. And Bruce, just to clarify what I said before about commercial potential there, I wasn't thinking of big requirements. I was thinking of, wouldn't it be nice if we're adding 500 to 600 people to that area to have a laundromat and another pizza shop and a mini mart there? That might benefit everybody. Not the extent we're talking about at university. But I largely agree that apartments are probably the right way to go.
So it sounds like there might be, Nate, some interest in at least allowing some mixed use buildings near the street, maybe. And so that could be part of the concept. Bruce. Bruce, are you hoping to speak?
Oh, yes, I am. Sorry about that. That idea of a tower again, I hadn't thought of that either, and it's not something that I necessarily would advocate. However, it's probably something that I might be inclined to explore, particularly if it was possible to perhaps have an entry from 116, which would basically allow for a different way of handling a great deal more traffic that would possibly be generated. So I don't know whether there's wetlands to be crossed down there or not, or whether the 116 would even contemplate that. But it's not a stupid. It's not an immediately insanely stupid suggestion or thought.
Nicely couched. All right, time is 9:04. Nate, we've had an opening conversation. Do you think you've got a little bit of the sense of the board?
I do. Yeah. I mean, it is really interesting. I like to, if I see this as the overlay, if it were, from say Presidential North to Meadow Street, I'd like to think the whole thing as one big site. And I agree that, having some mixed use could be beneficial in there. Having some open space could be beneficial. And so, how do you write an overlay when there's, multiple properties and it may not happen at once? And so, so I think there's some good considerations here about how to approach it. And I think, I think I can, talk to staff and come up with some ideas and have something for, the next meeting or two.
Okay.
I will say that we could allow some of these to be redeveloped now, but it's with a special permit and the bar is a little high, right? In terms of finding that a redevelopment is not more detrimental to the neighborhood. And so really what we'd be doing is we'd be making it, through site plan review with standards and conditions that would be reviewed by the planning board. And so we'd want to have some framework and some, like I said, standards and conditions and dimensional standards that work. And so, kind of like we did with University Drive overlay, certain setbacks and height, if it's near residential, maybe different setbacks along the street, some creative ideas for the interior of a site. Even if someone wanted to put a new public roadway in or roads, I feel like someone could come at this and say, wow, there's some really great opportunity here if we can, work together with neighboring properties.
Okay. Any more discussion tonight of this topic? All right. Time is 9:06 and we'll go on to next agenda item, old business, topics not reasonably anticipated. Do we have anything? Nate or Pam? Nope.
Doug, if I could interrupt, did you want to take public comment on that particular item that we've just
Well, I
completed?
think I had asked for it at one point and I didn't get any.
Sorry,
I
okay.
think I didn't get any hands, but I can certainly ask again. Any of the four members of the public who are still here? Pam Rooney. All right, Bruce, that was productive. Let's bring Pam over.
Hi, Pam.
Hi, Pam. Pam Rooney, 42 Cottage Street. Thank you, Bruce, for asking for public input. I would suggest that people go back, and I do not remember the year, but there was a fairly well coordinated and very comprehensive form-based zoning proposal that came to town meeting that was defeated because it seemed like it was forcing density on North Amherst. But many of the concepts were very well thought through, and if it had been completed in its entirety, would create a sort of a dense but well-coordinated development in North Amherst. So just suggesting that somebody find that proposal and take a look at it before you talk about apartment overlays. Thank you.
All right. Nate, does that ring a bell? Maybe? Would this, I heard the phrase form-based zoning for a while early in my residency here and thought it came to town meeting. Would it have been in the last 15 years or would it have been before that?
No, yeah, shortly after we did the master plan, we had, or during the master plan, we had, I'm blanking on the name, do a urban form analysis, and they looked at the kind of the north end of downtown, and I think North Amherst, subsequently then North Amherst, and so, I can find that.
Okay. All right, so we have Janet Keller next, and sounds like Pam Rooney has something to say after that.
Hi, Janet.
Hello, Janet.
I would just suggest that you take a look at the wetlands maps, especially in the western part of that area. And I would ask that Nate does that and show them to us at the next meeting. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Janet. Pam, can we bring Pam back?
Hi,
Hi,
Pam.
Pam.
Rooney again. Pam Rooney again, 42 Cottage Street. It was the North Amherst and Atkins Corner, I think, were done at about the same time. And these were proposals that were brought to town meeting and mostly defeated by residents of North Amherst. So obviously there needs to be some clear care taken, but some of the concepts were very valid and worth looking at again. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, sorry, that was, I was online looking, it's, from 2010 to 2012.
Okay. All right, I don't see any more hands from the public. Any more comments from the board on this? All right, we'll go on. Old business, I don't think there was any unanticipated old business. Is that right, Pam and Nate?
That's right.
Okay. Same for new business. Do we have new business that we need to talk about?
I don't have any.
All right. Form A&R subdivisions.
Well, we have one that I can show you. However, we have not, it's been reviewed and scrutinized by Chris Brestrup and the building commissioner and Nate. However, we haven't heard back from the town engineer. So I'm going to show it to you and ask that you think about endorsing this or having the chair endorse this with the idea that or with the caveat that if the town engineer comes back with a comment,
So we would look for a motion that or a consensus we usually just do with these, that it's okay for me to sign as long as the town engineer does not have any objections.
that's correct. Thank you. So this is property at 1720 South East Street. This is the Gray family estate. This is one big property here. And they are looking to divide it into actually 3 parcels. So what they're calling lot 1 is actually the home parcel that's got the residence on it. What would be considered parcel A here in the middle is property that would be sold to the folks who are actually farming it now, the biodynamic farm. And then parcel B would be retained with the Gray family. But as you can see, parcel A and parcel B would be labeled not buildable lots.
And this is because they don't have any frontage?
That is correct. Yeah. So they have these pathways here to get to those other areas. So this one here would take them out to here. This parcel B has sentimental value to the Gray family. Yes, and this portion in the middle is already being farmed by these folks, the biodynamic farms. So they're actually selling this portion of land to the folks who are farming it.
All right, board members, are you okay with me signing this once we hear back from the town engineer and assuming he has no objections? All right, I see several thumbs up and hear no objections to that. So Pam, let me know when you hear back from Jason Skeels.
I will. I will.
All right, I assume there are no other A&Rs?
No other A&Rs tonight. No.
How about ZBA applications? Anything we should be aware of?
Hey, do you want to talk about green leaves?
Yeah, Greenleaf has submitted an application to, when the Greenleaves was permitted, there was a number of phases and developments, and there was one piece that was never finished. And so they're going to a special permit to modify, older permits. And they want to, I think they were going to construct a community building, which they're not going to, and make some changes to the original plans. And so, that's, a transmittal was sent out and it's, headed to the zoning board.
All right,
And it's a pretty big development, it's south of Northampton Road, kind of behind Aspen Heights.
mhm.
So,
Is it something anybody wants to see, or at least like a site plan or anything? Not seeing a lot of enthusiasm on your faces. Is it just the hour? It's 9:16. Can't we talk about green leaves for a while? Okay, all right, so I
Oh.
think we're gonna let that one go.
Okay.
guys. Anything else for ZBA?
No, that's it.
All right, how
So-
about the SPP, SBR, SUBs?
Those we have several.
yeah, we have, on March 5th, so I guess we could, 422 Amity Street is coming back to the planning board at the next meeting. That's the development down in the corner of Amity and University Drive. And then the Jewish community of Amherst has submitted a site plan review application to put a solar canopy over their parking lot. And so that'd be modification to a site plan. There's changes to also the, some concrete pads and a few little utility work. The Amherst Soccer Club or Amherst Soccer Association is proposing to put a storage shed at Plum Brook Recreation Area. So that'll need a site plan review. I'm not sure exactly what, I think it might just be a shed. I'm not sure there's anything else there. And then Archipelago Investments has submitted a site plan review application to develop the properties around Atkins, the BVC zone properties. And they had applied for a variance from the zoning board last year and it wasn't approved. And so they've come back with a new plan for mixed use buildings. And it would be a site plan review application with waivers for height and various things. And so that's, would probably come in later March. The Jewish community of Amherst probably in early March. I think the Atkins one, Kyle Wilson wants to get in front of the planning board and have a conversation. It's, there'll be some things that'll come later if the hearings continue. He realized that this will probably be a multi-part hearing. It needs to get in front of the Conservation Commission as well. But he's looking for a few waivers, and I think his idea is if the planning board, he wants to see where the planning board, how it looks at this project, and that can help him, with the rest of the kind of permit review. So those are three that are, in the works.
All right, Bruce?
So Nate, that Archipelago Atkins end of town would be an informational hearing initially, so.
No,
No.
they've submitted an application with, information. We asked for a number of submittal requirements, which they met most of them, and then they're going to ask for waivers or to have some things be submitted after the first hearing. So they're continuing to work on it, given that it's a pretty extensive project.
So the hearing would be opened and continued
Yes.
probably multiple times.
right? It's kind of similar to the Amity Street one where, you know, they have a plan for the Conservation Commission, but the Conservation Commission may ask for changes to the site plan, and then it's gonna, you know, come back to the planning board, and so.
Okay,
So I'll be listing a lot of continuations before we're done.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, the site has arsenic, and so there's a, you know, it's a really complicated site, topography, a bunch of things. And so I think they're trying to manage all of that, and I think it's just gonna take kind of this process between Conservation Commission and planning until it can be worked out.
Okay. All right, committee and liaison reports. Bruce, anything on PVPC?
nothing. There's a meeting next Thursday, so maybe next time I'll have something, but not this time.
All right, Jesse, anything you want to follow up with housing?
Nope, you have heard everything we've talked about.
Okay. And
6
Karen?
sets of minutes waiting.
No,
All right,
nothing.
nothing for design review, okay. I guess I only have one thing I will say for as chair. The March 5th meeting, I will be away and Johanna will preside. And staff wanted to go ahead and have that meeting because of the I think it was the SUB application, or it was the
JCA.
the site plan review that we needed to get through. That's it for me. Nate and Pam, anything from staff?
I was gonna say, the design review board has looked at updating their design review principles. And, you know, there was it's not, you know, too extensive, but we sent that to Dodson and Flinker to help with their downtown design standards. And I think the design review board will continue to talk about that. And it may be that they would want that to then be part of a zoning change that would come to the planning board. So, you know, that's something that might be coming to the planning board in the next few months.
Okay.
So, you know, it's just something to be aware of. I was going to say that Dodson and Flinker still is, you know, going through their process with the downtown design standards, and so they're hoping to have a few more meetings, and then, you know, open meetings in the next few months. They did 2 online surveys, and they'll be holding more information. They're trying to refine the goal and vision, and get, you know, a little bit more, you know, material that then the public can respond to. So just, you know, for the board and everyone, just, you know, stay tuned. That's still ongoing. I think that's probably about it for now.
When is that process expected to finish?
I think it actually goes until this fall. So, you know, it has another, you know, 8 months. The idea would be that they have kind of draft design standards in the next 6 months. And then we've allowed, you know, a number of months where whether it's them or staff would go to different boards and committees, or maybe we'd have combined meetings to get input on it. And so to allow for, you know, a back and forth about what works and possible changes to it. So, you know, probably some preliminary standards out, you know, in the next few months, you know, both for the streetscape and then for building fronts and design.
Okay. All right. Anyone have anything else? All right. Time is 9:22, and I guess we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you. Right.
Hey, good night, everybody. Record.
Night, night, Pam.
Good night, Mr. Marshall. We'll see you soon. I'll be in touch.
Yep.